And welcome back to another video here from the Off-Grid Garage in sunny hot Australia. Got beautiful and nice sunshine today. Let's talk SEPLOS again. Well, if you are not interested in SEPLOS BMS or batteries or so, why not come back in a couple of days when we do some other battery testing or putting some solar panels on the roof or something. I have, if you are new to this, I have connected two SEPLOS batteries in parallel here as a temporary setup connected to our power wall with the Victron links distribution center up here, a Turbo GX, and a smart solar charge controller connected to a solar array outside. And we have a 3 kilowatt Xia inverter here for our load. So these batteries, first of all, this setup, what you see here, I mean there, what you see there, is not recommended by SEPLOS. They are not recommending to parallel different BMSes or different batteries together. This is a 280 ampere hour 48 volt system, and this is a 135 ampere hour 48 volt system, and they also have different BMSes. This is my master, this is my slave. They are connected via an RS485 cable, and then the master also is connected via VE.CAN to our Turbo GX here to report all the information of both batteries to the Victron system. And yeah, there are some challenges to do that, but I think I've figured it now out, and it is actually working nicely. I don't want to say but well, I'm testing this setup for like 4 weeks now here in this configuration, and I tested a lot of settings, a lot of configuration, a lot of changes, a lot of connection, different type of connections and everything, and even it is working in parallel and the communication is established and everything seems to be kind of good, workable. There are still some things I want to show you, and I want to do this in a non-judging way. I don't want to come over as too negative about the SEPLOS BMS or the SEPLOS system in total. Even it will sound negative in this video here, what I found, what I think is not optimal, but I want to hear from you as well how you see that. And because I found quite a few things, I don't want to pack them all in one video here. This would be like a 2 or 3 hour video. So I'm trying to break this all down into smaller video chunks, so it's easily accessible, digestible, and you can easily find it here on YouTube as well. There is a SEPLOS playlist on my channel as well, where I have grouped all SEPLOS related videos together in one playlist. So if you are thinking of buying a SEPLOS system, BMS or something, this would be the point to go. All the information, all the testing, everything is in this playlist. Okay, long intro short, let's get started. Alright, so in this video you will see 3 different screen recordings. One is coming from my tablet showing the remote console from Victron with the battery status and the solar charge controller status, and also the power going into our DC system, into our inverter. Now we've got the mobile phone showing the master BMS settings and status. And we also have the computer connected to our slave battery, to the smaller 135 ampere hour battery, showing also the state and the settings and what the BMS does. And you will see these 3 screens and myself in a random order. So whenever it makes sense to show you something, I'll put this here on the screen then and explain what's going on. So let me show you the settings in the master BMS. I don't want to go over all the settings here, only 2 of them, which is the total voltage over voltage protection. This is the maximum we can charge the battery to before the BMS turns off the charging function, right? Which is set to 55.2 volts. This is the maximum pack voltage I want to charge my battery to. This is the same setting as in the solar charge controller, and right next to it is the total pressure over pressure recovery. This is when it allows again the battery to be charged. So basically if we charge the battery now, it will turn off at 55.2, and then the voltage goes down again because we've got some load connected. At 55 volts, it will allow charging again, and then it charges the battery again to 55.2 volts. So this is the theory behind these two settings in the SEPLOS BMS. And this is already the big problem I can see with this design. Because as I said, we have set the 55.2 volt in the solar charge controller as well. But, okay, let me go into the solar charge controller. This is our pool fan system, and you can see at the top the state is not bulk absorption of load, it is external control. So the solar charge controller settings are not valid. Whatever I program in the solar charge controller, it won't use it as long as we have the BMS connected. Only if the BMS is disconnected for some reason, servo doesn't work, cable not connected, cable broken, someone pulled the cable out, then the solar charge controller will fall back to its own internal settings. So you should make sure these internal settings are still valid for this battery you have connected it to. So don't think, well, we don't use them anyway, I can set them to 60 volts or something. No, in case something happens with your communication or with the BMS, the solar charge controller always falls back to the settings inside. So if we go a little bit further down, here, network operation. So here we can see it is networked, yes, and the network status is slave. So it's following a master, which is the master BMS. The master BMS tells the solar charge controller what to do. Charging, discharging, how fast, how far, all this kind of stuff. The mode setting is external controller and BMS. By the way, these are all settings we cannot change here. This is just a view only page in the solar charge controller. And you can also see the charge current just went down from 10 amps to 0 amps because it won't charge at all anymore. Again, this is what the master BMS tells the solar charge controllers to do. Okay, so there is a bit of dependency between the master BMS and the solar charge controller, which makes sense. And this is the whole purpose of doing that. Because the BMS knows the best what the battery needs at the moment and communicates this to the Victron system, and then the charger, the solar charge controllers, or even if you have a hybrid inverter connected with an internal charger, it will follow this recommendation or this request from the BMS then and charge the battery accordingly. Okay, so 55.2, this is the maximum charge, and then 55, it allows charging again. And we are now having a look at the slave BMS, and we can see it is at 54.9 volts or 55 volts. There's no charging, no current going in or out. We have a total voltage over voltage protection because we have reached the 55.2 volts, and then the BMS stops or disallows further charging. Charging switch is turned off, but the discharge switch is still on. And as you can see here in the settings of the slave BMS, we've got the same settings as in the master. 55.2 volts, that's the maximum voltage we are allowing. And once we discharge to 55 volts, it turns on the charging switch again. So the delta is only 200 millivolt. And we can see here on the remote console, we are charging with around 100 watts now into the system. And this power goes into the slave battery at the moment, because if we have a look at the master BMS, we can see a protection status down up here. It says total voltage over voltage protection. So we must have hit the 55.2 volt with our system, and the master BMS has turned off. It disallows further charging. So everything which is coming in from the solar charge controller goes into the slave battery, and you will see this in a second. When we hit the 55.2 volts again, it will then disallow further charging and turns off the solar charge controller as well. Of course, we have a cloud right now, so it takes a while to charge. And you can already see what is happening here. Master and slave are not synchronized what they are doing. So depending on the state of charge, on the voltage of these two batteries now, it handles this individually. So we are charging the slave but not the master, right? It could be the other way around at some stage. So now the slave has turned off as well. We reached the 55.2. And we can see the solar charge controller throttles down now to 10 watts, 5 watts, and it will turn off in a minute all together. So, and now both batteries are getting discharged very slowly. Standby power of the Xia inverter. There's no load connected, nothing. And once they are hitting 55 volts again, the whole thing starts again. So, solar charge controller is now off, and everything is pretty much in standby, idling, not doing anything at all. And because we are using some power for the inverter at the moment, this power is coming solely from the batteries and not from the solar charge controllers. And I want to show you this here on the Victron system. Let's have a look in the advanced tab here, what our battery voltage and current does. And this is happening for a while since we fully charged the battery. And I want to zoom in here just a bit on this part. And you can see what the SEPLOS BMS does with the battery. And this is what I think is not ideal at all at a high state of charge, which we have in the battery. We are almost at 99.5% state of charge. We have fully absorbed at 55.2 volts. And the BMS is actually microcycling the battery at this high state of charge. So you can see the blue line here in this graph going up, then discharging, going up again, discharging, going up, discharging. And it does this forever, right? It keeps the 55.2 volts, then it turns off the solar charge controller, waits until we hit the recovery voltage of the BMS, and then turns on the charger again. And the yellow graph accordingly is the current when we get the peak from the solar charge controller. You can see it down here as well. This is the voltage and current from the solar charge controller. So whenever there's demand for the battery to charge, the solar charge controller will kick in, recharge the battery to 55.2, and then cycle all the time. And I think this is less than ideal for several reasons. First of all, I'm really not happy that they are using the maximum charge voltage of the BMS to stop charging, right? I mean, the BMS is a safety device in your system. It should be there to protect the battery under any circumstances. What we are doing here and using the BMS for is for charging the battery. And this should not be part or a task of the BMS. This should be part of our solar charge controller, right? So in theory, we set the solar charge controller to 55.2, and then it stops charging at this point of time. And the BMS sits on 56 volts or on 57 or 58 volts, somewhere far higher than we actually charge to. And in case the solar charge controller does not work, is faulty, and it keeps charging, the BMS is there to protect the battery from overcharging. But this is not how we use the BMS here in this system, right? We are using it to charge our battery. The second point I'm not happy with is the BMS tells the solar charge controller to completely turn off. And this is not right in my opinion, because we still have sunshine outside, and the solar charge controller should now kick in and supply power to our load, which is connected to our system, and keep the battery at a constant 55.2 volts without cycling it at this point. Unfortunately, it is a bit cloudy at the moment, so I cannot demonstrate what's going on. But you can see it here in the remote console. The solar charge controller is on 0 watts, and you can still see the battery voltage is slowly coming down because there's the standby power of the inverter still connected. So I'm not saying microcycling is bad for the battery, but it is at this higher voltage. At this state of charge, I think this is less than ideal. And the other thing which is not ideal here is the missing of a float state for this system now. The SEPLOS BMS only requests a maximum charge voltage from our system, from our solar charge controller. And the solar charge controller follows this request. Here in our diagram, okay, I did a bit of discharge here in this area, but now you can see it's back on this maximum charge voltage of 55.2 volts. The BMS never requests a float voltage. It always keeps the battery on these 55.2 volts. I think this is, again, less than ideal for the battery to keep it at this higher voltage. And as we have seen in the many tests we have done here on the channel, there's no need to keep the battery at 55.2 volts forever for the rest of the day until the sun goes down. There's no capacity gain, there's no benefit, the battery doesn't perform any better or has any other beneficial advantages of doing that. And there was a bit of a discussion in the Victron community forum recently about exactly that. And someone requested a feature from Victron to set a float voltage if you are connected to an external BMS. And the Victron guys actually responded and said, well, this is not up to us, this is up to what the BMS requests. So there was a bit of back and forward going on. And because the SEPLOS BMS is not officially supported by the Victron system, neither of the sides, neither Victron nor SEPLOS, may do anything about it. And everyone thinks their system is working fine and just doing what the other system is requesting or demanding. And yeah, I know we had this discussion here before on the channel, and some people recommended saying, why don't you use the REC or the REC BMS? Because the REC BMS has a float setting in its configuration, so we can actually do an absorption and then a float stage what the BMS is requesting from the solar charge controller. Because remember what I said at the beginning, the solar charge controller settings are completely ignored at the moment as long as it is connected to the BMS. So if you recharge your battery to your maximum charge voltage of 55.2 volts, or if you want to charge higher for whatever reason, the SEPLOS BMS will keep your battery on this high state of charge, on this high voltage for the rest of the day. Just be aware of that. I personally don't like this at all. Neither do I like a microcycling at such a high voltage or high state of charge. Okay, let's wait until the sun comes out again, hopefully very soon, and then I'll show you what the microcycling actually does. Okay, full sunshine at the moment. We are charging 300 watts. This is all which is requested from the BMS. And we're supplying our power to the load and recharging the slave battery. The master battery still doesn't take anything because the charging is still disabled. So this shows you also that the slave BMS can actually request power from the solar charge controller. It doesn't need to wait for a request from the master. All the slave batteries can do this themselves. They can turn on and turn off the charging through the solar charge controller. So every battery acts basically individually in regards to the power demand from the solar charge controller. So why do we connect them all together and have a common data stream to the Victron system? Exactly. So now the slave battery went to 55.2 volts and turned off the charging. Charger has stopped. And now the voltage is slowly coming down because we are taking away power. Got 120 watts connected at the moment. And as soon as we hit 55 volts, the charger switch will be enabled again, and then it turns on the solar charge controller again. While at the moment the power is coming from the master battery. As you can see, it has turned on. And still no power from the solar charge controller. So it's discharging the master battery at the moment. So there is no real consistency how this all works. It depends all what battery demands energy from the solar charge controller, which one has turned off charging and doesn't deliver any power to the load. So it's a very dynamic system, and there's a lot to see and a lot to observe, but there's no real consistency how this all works together. So for me, it looks like these batteries are all acting just by themselves as individual batteries, individual BMS. They can request power, they can turn off power. Like now the slave battery is recharging from the solar until 55.2, and then it will turn off. And the master battery is still doing nothing. There, turned off. And now you can see immediately the solar charge controller turns off as well. Even we have load still connected. And it's discharging the slave battery again. So this is another little microcycle at this higher voltage, which I don't like at all. And you can see the two voltages between master and slave battery. This is actually the battery voltage and not the bus voltage. So you can have different voltages in these batteries, even they are parallel together. And it took me a while to understand why that is. So we now have over 0.4 volts difference between the master and the slave, and there's no equalization current or something going on because charging is still turned off in the master. And then I found it weird because the master is actually a higher voltage than the slave, and the slave accepts charging. Why is it not charging from the master to the slave then, right? So, but it's not doing it. There's nothing going in between the batteries. And I don't quite understand why that is, because they are in parallel and they should have the same voltage. But because of this switching effect of the MOSFETs for charging, it seems like they are measuring the internal battery voltage and not the bus voltage. So there's always a bit of a difference. And now the solar is trying to recharge the battery to 55.2. I'll turn off all the load now. So we've got maximum power into the battery, which is only 2 amps. But now you will see the weirdness of this whole system, because the slave battery is now recharging to 55.2 volts, while the master will not, because charging is disabled still. We've got a warning, an alarm there from the last microcycle. And you can see they are acting completely independent now. So I'm again questioning, why do we need this communication if this is happening? You know, they are not talking to each other as I was expecting it. And I want to ask the question out there because, as I said at the beginning, this is a non-recommended setup what I am driving here. 2 different battery capacities and 2 different BMSs in parallel. Is this still happening when you have only the same capacity and only the same BMS? Or are all your voltages you can see always the same because they are in parallel? Are they all acting as one battery, or do you see one BMS turning off while the other one is still charging or discharging? Are they somehow synchronized? So, and now slave and master battery have the same voltage, but we are charging only the slave battery. Charging is still disabled in the master. So the slave will hit 55.2 volts at some stage, while the master will stay at this point. And this is a problem occurring if you change the settings to a higher voltage delta between disconnecting charging and reconnecting charging, so the recovery voltage. And you can see a quite large delta in between the 2 battery packs then. But at the moment it will neither charge nor discharge. It leaves everything to the slave battery, and this one is microcycling again. So that's not good. So we are almost at 55 volts with our slave battery, while the master is still at 54.66 volts. Cloudy weather at the moment, so not much solar is coming in. But as you can see how the voltage delta changes now from the master being the higher voltage battery, and now the slave is a lot higher than the master. And there's no equalization going on. Okay, we have now reached the 55.2 volts in the slave, and we will see the solar charge controller turns off again, and we are starting another microcycle, while the master BMS has again turned off Bluetooth. But we can see it's still at 54.66 volts, so it hasn't moved at all. And now the load is discharging the slave battery again instead of the solar charge controller, using the existing solar energy to do that. So in here in the Victron via M, we can see the battery voltage here, how it's been microcycled up and down, up and down. And this was the load we have introduced by connecting Miss Piggy, the heat gun, with another 400 watts, so it discharged the battery a bit, but then it comes back, and you can see the kink at the top there. It's starting another microcycle right now, so discharging the battery again. And if we go back into the system, we can see 0.5 of an amp gets discharged into the inverter standby current, but again microcycling, while this power could come from the solar directly, but the BMS does not do that. And by the way, you can see all these data here online. You just go to this BAT calibration center in the Victron VIM. You can see all the data I have collected so far with the system, with the SEPLOS system. And just zoom in and you can see the microcycling yourself, what the solar charge controllers do at the same time. I put the link to the VIM down under the video so you can have a look at this BAT calibration center. Yeah. Okay guys, I think so far this video for today, telling you what I have found so far with the SEPLOS BMSs and batteries. This is not all by a long shot, but these are the main concerns I have with these systems. So keeping the battery on a high state of charge, on a higher voltage without going to float is probably the first one, and then the microcycling kicking in if you have not so much load connected at the time. With a higher load it won't matter because it doesn't recharge the battery anymore then. And then the weird, uncontrolled, unsynchronized behavior of both batteries. Even they are connected via RS485, but they are not acting like one battery or something. But again, they could be because it's a different battery, a different BMS, and this setup is not recommended from SEPLOS. So I'm testing and trying here. And well, so far it is working, but I just don't like the microcycling and keeping the battery that high. So this would be something I would not like to install in my system and stress out the batteries for no reason. And as I said before, guys, I want to hear from you about this. If you have multiple SEPLOS batteries, how is your voltage? How is your microcycling situation, if you have any, if you fully charge your battery? Can you see the BMS turn off the solar charge controllers as well? And then the battery gets discharged a bit before it kicks in again and gets recharged by the solar. Instead of keeping the battery at a constant voltage and the solar takes over your load then. And also what kind of settings you have used for your SEPLOS battery with multiple banks in parallel. What is your turn-off voltage for the BMS? Do you just keep the battery on a higher voltage or higher state of charge and don't worry about it, don't care about it? I want to hear from you back. So please leave all your comments and experience down in the video description. Not just for me, but for everyone else. There are lots and lots of people emailing me about SEPLOS. They want to know more. They want to see more testing here on the channel. And I probably have a ton of information still here. I need to put in videos and put them out there, so people can see what they're getting into if they buy a SEPLOS BMS. And this all sounds pretty negative at the moment, but I'm really trying to make SEPLOS here succeed with their products. I think they are fantastic products. The Mason battery case is insanely good. The BMS seems to be very well designed, and they have the biggest advantage at hand: the ability of their BMSs to be upgraded with a new firmware. I mean, no other fully integrated BMS has this capability, but I think they are not really realizing what they have in their hands there. And progress is very, very slow, very slow. At the moment, they've got the Chinese New Year over there, so until end of January, there will be nothing happening at all. There will no decisions being made, no further Everything takes a lot longer than I was expecting it. But yeah, we want to stay positive here. So it is possible to connect different capacities, different BMSs together in parallel and make the system work. Okay guys, don't forget to leave your comments down there. Share your experience with these setups. What do you see? What do you experience? This will be very interesting to read. And guys, as always, thank you so much for watching. Thanks for all your amazing support here on the channel. Until the next video, you stay charged, stay safe, and thanks again for watching. See you then. Bye bye.